Hello. I've been reflecting a lot recently on the nature of occult practice, thinking about my own work and what I do in terms of my own cultivation of spiritual process or self-discovery or whatever we want to call these things, and looking around at the other people who share the same interests as me, of magic and the occult and the way that they approach these things. I had a really interesting opportunity recently to be at a conference, Occulture, in Berlin. Fantastic conference, great respect to all the organisers and all the participants and people who came together to make it such a fantastic event. And it was really fascinating to see people bringing all kinds of different styles, all kinds of different process, from looking at kind of hermetic magic or tarot, looking at kind of thelemic influence material and Enochian and so forth, bringing these things together, shamanism, these different kind of approaches. And I guess I've been thinking about this quite a lot as well in terms of turning 50 and having the opportunity to kind of reflect back on the way my own magical practice has looked. So there have been points in my story where it's been really formal, ceremonial, sometimes on my own, but typically within group contexts. And I continue to do a lot of that kind of work. But I think one of the interesting things is I have noticed over time some interesting changes. So one of them is that although I do find myself sometimes, and have done fairly recently, doing things like sigil magic, so where you have I guess results magic, got a specific intention, encode that, create a sigilized form, and so on. Standard Austin Spare a kind of approach to these sorts of things. So sometimes I find myself doing results magic, let's call it. But most of the time, I find that what I'm trying to do is not so much grasp for a particular outcome in the universe, but to kind of cultivate my own position to be responsive and receptive and know when and where to act in the universe in general. So rather than trying to have these kind of moments of magic that affect everything, trying to create a magical life. And the way that seems to unfold for me is something that I used to kind of really hate the idea of when I was a budding young magician, which was that I would have older magicians say to me, well, what happens is that as you get older, your practice becomes sort of simpler, it becomes more pared down. And I thought, well, this doesn't sound very exciting, where all the sigils and the magic names and the complexity of the ritual, or the paraphernalia at the very least. And I have found that, for me at least, this narrative is broadly true, that my practice now becomes simpler and in a way kind of more open-ended. So recently I've been doing the Gnostic Pentagram ritual as part of my regular practice, a ritual which I learned, I guess 20 years ago. Really nice version of essentially a middle pillar style orientation, and then an orientation to the directions using the vowel sounds rather than particular god names or other iconography that has a more specific kind of cultural form. I really like that. It's a real nice piece of kind of postmodern, meta-modern magical technique. So I've been doing that as a practice. So this really relatively simple thing. But that's part of a balanced diet consisting of other practices like straightforward mindfulness of breath, meditation, yogic practice, other sorts of insight practices, I guess you would call them, and then these kind of occasional other pieces of ritual work that emerge for me. So it becomes, I guess if I look back at my magical career in terms of the last, 5-10 years, something like this, that although there are these big ceremonial works that I'm still very much engaged with, instead of creating my own desire magic, my own results magic, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to cultivate my own sensitivity and relationship with the universe and the weird, so that I can act in a good way. I guess this is the way that one would think about acting in terms of one's inner nature or true will. however you want to frame these sorts of ideas. So a lot of that is about kind of listening to the unconscious and the tides that are within that, to the deep mind. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, because when we act to do results magic, that's completely cool, but we have to be sailing on the right tide. So we have to be aware of where things are in ourselves and in our narrative and our story, so that the results magic that we put in, or the intentions that we activate, which we can activate through pragmatic stuff that we do in the world, letters we send, emails we have, conversations, things that we buy or don't buy, all of those kind of acts in the world, so that those acts in the world can unfold in the right way, quotes right way, whatever that means, in a way that is appropriate to our weird, to our magic, to our true will. And in order for that to happen, what we're often doing, what I find myself often doing, is like putting aside a lot of my individual narrative desirous self and being aware of the moment in meditation, being focused in terms of opening up the body and dealing with any of the locks, the psychological, physiological locks that happen within the body armor through yogic practice and through Tai Chi. Doing things like banishing rituals like the Gnostic pentagram ritual, these other practices which are about like just clearing the way. And then when I find myself in altered states of awareness, often rather than having a specific intention, just using this to kind of, as a refining kind of process, wanting to refine myself so that I can be, that I can aspire to the level of being a Taoist butcher. So for those who don't know the story of the better Taoist butcher, broadly speaking, there's a lot of detail and variance. There's essentially that there's a butcher who's a Taoist, and he has a knife, and the knife has been a knife that he's used to butcher animals for 20 years, and he hasn't had to sharpen the knife over all this time. And the reason he hasn't had to sharpen the knife is because what he does is, as he comes to the carcass of the animal, he just feels into it, and the knife finds the right way through the body of the beast. And in doing so, it doesn't knock into any of the bones, it doesn't come into any contact that damages its blade, and it becomes this knife that just appears to flow easily and smoothly through the carcass as though it's butter. And I guess really with magic, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Not that we're going to have lives that never have problems or difficulties or suffering, because that's just the human condition, but that we're attempting to find our way, to find the right way through the weird that we inhabit, through the time that we inhabit. And sometimes that's about throwing these intentions, throwing these desires into the future. And sometimes it's about kind of reading and reflecting on situations through divinatory practice. But often, and I think increasingly for me as I get older, it's about just listening and about being sensitive to things and attempting to be in good relationship with the spirits that you find around you, for the benefit of yourself and, with any luck, all those other beings. So just a few thoughts. Thank you for listening. Ahoy.